Retirement doesn't seem to have been a concept for Arthur Sullivan. If it had been, he would have ended his active career in the immediate wake of the triumphant premiere of Ivanhoe in January 1891. His reputation as the great man of British music was unassailable. The Gondoliers was enjoying a successful run at the Savoy Theatre, and his cantata The Golden Legend had become the national choral work of choice, being performed on 3 occasions in London alone during that year. His income peaked at approximately £30,000 per annum, and given the ongoing performing rights and royalties from the Savoy operas and the rest of his oeuvre, together with a decade of profitable investment, even given his lavish lifestyle, there was no reason for his continuing to make the kind of physical and mental demands on himself that composition took. Yet throughout the 1890s, Sullivan continued to work, completing 6 operas and a ballet for the Savoy and Alhambra theatres. So the obvious question to ask is, why did he continue? The simplest answers seem to be the most obvious ones, that he both wanted and needed to compose. By his final decade, 2 issues drove him. The most fundamental, earning an income via his music, driven by the memory of his parents' poverty. Whatever Sullivan had accumulated, and irrespective of his lifestyle, there was never enough money. The other, to move beyond the confines, determined over the previous decade by his work with W.S. Gilbert. Sullivan's comment to an exasperated Sidney Grundy made his position clear. Given Gilbert's termination of their partnership in 1890, Sullivan probably did not anticipate working with him again. He may have felt relief. Certainly the experiment of Ivanhoe and the blank canvas that followed appeared to offer a freedom for development, missing during the 1880s. Freedom, however, proved elusive. Gilbert may, temporarily, have been concealed in the long grass, but the necessity of finding a librettist still remained. And with the closure of the Royal English Opera House in 1892, so, in pursuit of his income, did the necessity of accommodating the audience at the Savoy Theatre. What did Sullivan want from his librettist? In 1884 he explained to Gilbert, "I want a chance for the music to intensify the emotional element, not only of the words, but of the situation. I should like to set a story of human interest, where humorous words would come in a humorous situation, where, if the situation were a tender or dramatic one, the words would be of a similar character. There would then be a feeling of reality about it." 6 librettists in a decade following his 15-year partnership with W.S. Gilbert may suggest a failure of critical judgment on Sullivan's part, but such an assumption is based solely on Sullivan's immediate past history, an assumption based on a business-as-usual model projected by numerous biographers of the Gilbert and Sullivan partnership, rather than any new direction that he chose to pursue, or that his impresario Richard D'Oyley Carte might have suggested to him. For example, according to Sidney Grundy, Carte was the instigator of his writing for Sullivan, proposing 6 libretti. It is also worth emphasising that all the 1890s librettists enjoyed successful careers, though of those 6, only Basil Hood and W.S. Gilbert had any recent experience of writing for music. Frank Burnand, librettist of Sullivan's earliest operettas Cox and Box and the Contrabandista, edited Punch. Sidney Grundy had worked with Edward Solomon. He and Arthur Pinero were the most popular dramatists of the decade, while Joseph Cummins Carr had collaborated with Sullivan in King Arthur for Henry Irving. Basil Hood had a background in burlesque and musical comedy, and Gilbert was Gilbert. After the implosion of their partnership, 3 years passed before Sullivan accepted Gilbert's Utopia Limited. He must have been expecting business as usual, but Gilbert, infatuated by American concert soprano Nancy McIntosh, and determined to make her a star, adapted what Sullivan had agreed to, metamorphosing a satire on government into a rambling romance. Nancy's role was enlarged, resulting in Act 2 completely losing momentum, while as a whole providing Sullivan with little stimulus. It's difficult to find inspiration from company law and sanitation. Utopia, at 245 performances, was not a failure. but it had not produced the anticipated run and proved phenomenally expensive to mount, thus hitting Sullivan's income, since he received his share of the profits rather than the box office percentage that he would have preferred, and his frustration with Gilbert's protégé can be felt in this diary entry. Told G frankly my opinion that she would never be a singer, and she had no sympathy in her voice, consequently of no use to us at the Savoy. With Frank Bernand in 1894 contributing a libretto cobbled from the 1867 Contrabandista, Sullivan adapted old and added new material. As the chieftain, it ran for 97 performances, before falling victim to the most savage winter in living memory and the Russian flu pandemic. The Chieftain is perhaps the closest Sullivan came to musical comedy, and it had its moments. Here is one.
Let us lead a life of pleasure, let us tread a lively measure, time defying merrily, singing also cheerily, drink to the gay huzzah, the gay huzzah, the gay huzzah. At the trumpet call by steady, ready at command, I ready. Here and there a comrade lies, here and there a foeman dies, killed by the fierce huzzah. The fierce huzzah, the fierce huzzah. Hey, boys, jolly let us be, boys. Hey, boys, drink about to be, boys, till we go to meet the foe with a dash and a loud hurrah. Drink, drink, military measure, clink, clink, lead a life of pleasure, sing and drink, our glasses clink to the life of a gay huzzah. Hey boys, jolly let us be, boys. Hey boys, drink about the be, boys, till we go to meet the foe with a dash and a loud hurrah. Drink, drink, military measure, clink, clink, lead a life of pleasure, sing and drink, our glasses clink to the life of a gay huzzah.
His final collaboration with Gilbert, the Grand Duke, was written in 1896 following an acrimonious hiatus. Sullivan refused to compose if Nancy McIntosh featured, and Gilbert refused to write without her. With the Grand Duke, Gilbert literally lost the plot, leaving an exasperated Sullivan writing to Bernand after the premiere, stating, "Why reproach me? I didn't write the book." Another week's rehearsal with WSG and I should have gone raving mad. I'd already ordered some straw for my hair. Conducting the premieres, Sullivan recorded redundant dialogue. 2 days later, he abandoned a wintry London for the Riviera, leaving Gilbert unchecked to prune, further adding to the imbalance by amputating 3 of the best numbers from Act 2. Here is one.
Take my advice when deep in debt, set up a bank and play a roulette, and once his trust your soul he'll lull and rook the pigeon and the gull. The bird will stake his every franc in wild attempt to break the bank, but you may stake your life and limb, the bank will end by breaking him. Alors encore, garçon Piet, pour Louis d'or de charrette. Hola, 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 hola. Mais faites vos jeux, allons la classe, le temps se passe, la bombe se casse. Rien ne va plus. Le 17 mois, un paix manque. Hola, hola, vive la banque. For every time the board you spin, the bank is bound to win. For every time the board you spin, the bank is bound to win.
The Grand Duke ran for 123 performances, and with his relationship once more descending into acrimony, Sullivan did not work with Gilbert again. A diary comment from the 11th of November 1898 indicates that this was a conscious decision. Basil Hood came and discussed the possibility of doing a new piece together. I know of no one so good now, putting Gilbert out of the question, of course. The Sullivan and Gilbert partnership had ended without formal closure, and with the burial of a vintage Sullivan score for the best part of a century. Arthur Pinero and Joseph Commons Carr did the libretto for the Beauty Stone. Sullivan, initially excited by the prospect of a variant on a Faust theme, with the devil controlling the action, found his creativity pushed to breaking point via Carr's convoluted lyrics. He produced one of his finest scores, but the audience found Pinero's mock medieval dialogue tedious. The Beauty Stone ran for just 50 nights. As the Beauty Stone premiered, Sullivan was contacted by James Davis, Owen Hall, librettist of Gaiety and Daly's musical comedies, and Savoy Curtain Raisers. Sullivan responded positively and frankly. "I'm quite willing to work with you, although I've made up my mind to give up comic opera writing, but as I want to devote the next 3 or 4 years to making money and nothing else, and as there are very few ways open to a composer, I might as well go on." Although depressed by the Beauty Stone's failure, his statement indicates he was prepared to adapt his output to whatever circumstances offered, and is one of the few indicators of the way in which he viewed himself and his work. The jobbing musician rather than the high-minded artist, so lauded by contemporaries who identified with the English musical Renaissance. What did Sullivan want? His own comments to Gilbert in 1884 were straightforward. An uncomplicated plot, characters that he could empathise with and whose fate an audience would care about, exactly what Basil Hood and the Rose of Persia provided. Sullivan responded with a glorious late flowering of warmth and inventiveness. Building on its success, Hood prepared the Emerald Isle. Incomplete at Sullivan's death, the remaining fragments leave a promise of what might have been. Over the course of the 1880s, Sullivan had earned a fortune as a specific following had attached itself to his works with Gilbert. If that meant there was tremendous goodwill towards him and anything he wrote, witnessed at the premiere of Utopia Limited, regarded by both press and public alike as a national event, expectation restricted his freedom to experiment. The Savoy audience knew what it liked and liked what it knew. This is most conspicuous with Haddon Hall and the Beauty Stone. In both cases, Sullivan clearly wanted to move beyond the confines of the cage. The furthest the Savoy audience had been prepared to go with his Gilbert operas was The Yeoman of the Guard. Its dark plot and operatic score were unexpected aberrations. Its successor, The Gondoliers, represented the G&S oeuvre at its most formulaic, harking back to the cheerful, uncomplicated days of the Mikado. Audiences loved it. All the elements were there. The colourful Venetian setting and costumes, jolly choruses, a patter song, a madrigal, a fizzing Act One finale, and tailor-made numbers, the company favourites, such as Rosina Brandram, Curtis Pounds, Jessie Bond, and Rutland Barrington. Haddon Hall, with a libretto by Sidney Grundy, was billed as an original light English opera. Interviewed immediately before its premiere, Sullivan attempted to prepare the audience. The public must not come to the Savoy with the impression that they are going to see a comic opera, but to see and hear an opéra comique, which, from his perspective, represented two entirely different genres. Haddon Hall concerned the elopement of Dorothy Vernon. Grundy relocated the action to the English Civil War, intruding comedy Puritans into a story of love in adversity. This bolt-on comedy element was surely intended as an audience pleaser and to provide comedy roles for company stars such as William Denny, playing the McCranky, a bagpipe-wielding stage Scotsman. The Beauty Stone offered the Savoy audience no compromise at all. Sullivan, although enthused by the scenario, immediately identified its central difficulty. "I like it immensely, but I don't know whether it is too serious." Pinero and Carr, inexperienced in writing for musical theatre, refused to accommodate Sullivan's ideas. Both Carr and Pinero, gifted and brilliant men, with no experience of writing for music, yet obstinately declining to accept any suggestion from me. Quod scripsi, scripsi, they both say. Or to listen to Sullivan's issues with casting. Joe Carr and Pinero are enthused over Ruth Vincent, their ideal. I told them Vincent wasn't strong enough for principal or second principal soprano. Working with Carr's convoluted lyrics drove him to exhaustion and mental breakdown. Yet he produced a score of emotional intensity, complexity and colour. Unfortunately, very few heard it. Interviewed immediately before the premiere by the Daily Mail, Sullivan emphasised the Beauty Stone's uniqueness. This piece is of a totally different character to anything we have had at the Savoy Theatre. It is a romantic drama. I am so afraid the audience will come, expecting a comic opera, and will be disappointed. Sullivan encapsulated the Savoy's problem. Audiences expecting the usual catchy tunes and uncomplicated entertainment. But the sophistication of Sullivan's score was far removed from the easy approachability of HMS Pinafore, and Pinero's cod medieval dialogue made for a long, turgid evening. The Savoy favourites were largely missing. In fact, there was not a lot to like about the Beauty Stone for the regular patron. Bad Savoy entertainment, preserved in the aspic of the previous decade. As Bridgman in 1913 recounted, this ill success was partly due to the indisposition of the disciples of Gilbert and Sullivan to accept any entertainment that disturbed the traditions of their popular temple. Closing after 50 performances, Sullivan, still on a profit-sharing contract, had effectively worked for 6 months on the Beauty Stone for nothing, compromising both his health and his position as general conductor at the Leeds Festival. Surprisingly, he continued to believe in the Beauty Stone, and with a more appropriate cast it toured in 1901 with the Carl Rosa Company. Provincial reviews indicate audiences less prejudiced against it than those at the Savoy. Sullivan had twice attempted to rattle the bars of his cage, at first with Haddon Hall obtaining moderate success, followed by absolute disaster with the Beauty Stone. In terms of income and exposure, he needed the Savoy, just as much as the Savoy management needed a composer whose name virtually guaranteed box office, which was, again, to throw him with the Rose of Persia into the arms of the Savoy audience. It was no coincidence that the Daily Telegraph could maintain at its premiere, "The musician is once again absolutely himself," With Basil Hood in charge of the book, given his experience in musical comedy, the Savoy cage took on a lighter variant, but it was still a cage. What worked in the past found new additions, like the topical song.
Let a satirist enumerate a catalogue of crimes, though he label them the outcome of a shallow modern times. Yet a Persian punch his pencil in a prehistoric peep would show us human nature just as shallow or as deep. It is money more than manners nowadays that makes a man, and a man may make his money in such manner as he can. And the more he makes of it, the more his friends will make of him. That has always been the way since human sharks began to swim. And cynics may complain that society is mixed, but I gather in the main its ingredients are fixed. And society has always been a sort of ginger pop. The dregs are at the bottom and the froth is at the top. And society has always been a sort of ginger pop. For the dregs are at the bottom and the froth is at the top.
However, Hood's libretto gave Sullivan the opportunity he had asked of Gilbert in 1884, to allow the music to develop and speak for itself as the plot unfolded. He must have felt a sense of relief that the new opera worked, writing, "I conducted as usual. Hideously nervous as usual. Great reception as usual. Great house as usual. Excellent performance as usual. Everything as usual. Except that the piece is really a great success, I think, which is unusual lately." It's interesting in researching Sullivan's late works how condemnatory the secondary sources are. Thomas Dunhill in 1928 stated of the Grand Duke, "There cannot be the slightest chance of survival, and in justice to Sullivan's memory, it is to be hoped that it will never be heard again," commenting that Rose descends very definitely to the level of musical comedy, where the librettist drags the composer down with him. Arthur Jacobs referred to the Beauty Stone as a sad milestone. Alan Hayman seemed to regard Sullivan's output in the 90s as a prequel to his funeral. The received image is that these late works were substandard. The glitter had gone, and they were the final scrapings of Sullivan's rapidly diminishing creativity. In fairness to 20th century critics faced with piano vocal scores to form opinion, it's not really surprising that, shorn of the subtlety and colour of Sullivan's orchestrations, the late operas seemed disappointing. But if reviews of the original productions are considered, a very different picture emerges in London and as they toured the provinces. The initial responses to both the Chieftain and the Grand Duke were positive towards Sullivan's scores, if more equivocal towards their librettos. The reviews for the Beauty Stone were more positive and far less condemnatory than implied by Jacob's citation of a single source, a critic notoriously antagonistic towards Sullivan. The Rose of Persia met with unqualified success, the Pall Mall Gazette's Vernon Blackburn going so far as to state, "Sullivan today is Mozart's legitimate successor. His Rose of Persia has proved as much." These late operas profitably visited the provinces and met with receptive audiences, suggesting that to the public the magic of a work by Sullivan, even when contrasted with the latest musical comedies, remained undiminished. But as the 20th century began, possibly when William Greet took over the management of the Savoy and the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company in 1901, a decision was reached, perhaps determined by cost, to concentrate on touring the core GNS repertoire, and Sullivan's late works were quietly allowed to die. In September 1899, the costumes for the Grand Duke and the Beauty Stone were sold off. Rose enjoyed a brief professional revival in 1935, while Haddon Hall and Utopia Limited clung to the fringes of amateur repertoire until the Second World War. But the received image, underpinned by D'Oyly Carte management's reluctance or outright refusal to hire band parts, was of tarnished grandeur and of scores best left decently buried. The Sullivan Renaissance emerging from the 1980s, together with new scholarly editions of these late operas, has enabled reappraisal, a cause that has undoubtedly been assisted by recent professional recordings doing justice, particularly towards the Beauty Stone, one of Sullivan's subtlest and most innovative scores that had languished unknown for over a century. The evidence suggests that as the 20th century began, Sullivan's creativity was far from exhausted. The rumour of his working for Augustin Daly continued to circulate, to the disconcertion of d'Oyly Carte management. He was actively pursuing writing a French language work, prompted by the chanteuse Yvette Gilbert. There was the possibility of 2 grand operas, one for Monte Carlo, with a libretto by Armand Silvestre, which may have been rumour. The other, based on the legend of St. Cecilia for Clara Butt, written by Basil Hood and destined for Covent Garden, was certainly real and received widespread press coverage in 1900. There was some suggestion that Sullivan might have followed the lead taken by Stanford with Seamus O'Brien in forming a company specifically for St. Cecilia, which would have broken the Savoy and Carte's stranglehold. Hood, interviewed in 1902, maintained that the book was complete, and Sullivan, at the time of his death, was working on musical themes. Clara Butt commented that the opera was underway, wondering what had happened to it. And there was the Emerald Isle. Those are what-ifs, but they are tantalising enough to speculate on where Sullivan's muse would have taken him in the new century, had death not claimed him first.